I think they're trying to destroy America.
Let's listen to more accusations before trying to understand who they are.
And keep in mind, my husband is infamous, Princeton graduate, chief of staff for Al Gray, who runs all the dirty tricks for the Army. You know, Linda Tripp worked for Carl Steiner, who was a partner of, Jim Joy and Carl Steiner and my husband were the triumvirate in Beirut.
Okay.
And Linda Tripp worked for Carl Steiner down there.
This would be approximately
in the 80s. She and her husband were both Delta Force duos. They send them, but then they divorced, so that broke up that. But she's a dirty tricks person, Linda.
She believes that Linda Tripp was helping to set President Clinton up for blackmail. She also claims that the U.S. military was manipulated during the 1991 Iraqi war for purposes of selling weapons, smuggling drugs, and laundering money.
It's kind of like Monica and Bill. I think they put Monica in there to have something on Bill. That's my own feeling. Sarah McClendon feels the same way. Because...
And Linda Tripp was there to guide the situation.
Absolutely. Of course. Linda Tripp was Delta Force. Linda Tripp was trained by Carl Steiner, who's in the diary with my husband. Carl Steiner is called a snake. And he tried to trip up Schwarzkopf. I mean, he was trying to take the whole Iraqi thing over because they had been baiting, using the Israeli rogues in Turkey. They were having little zigzag wars. It's all to sell weapons. It's all about weapon sales. It's all about drugs. It's all about funny money.
Most people assume that the U.S. military wanted the Vietnam War, but she claims that the military was pushed into Vietnam by the same group who were behind the bombing of Dresden during World War II. She supports the accusation that the American military was fooled into bombing Dresden simply to slaughter the German civilians. She also supports the accusation in Michael Piper's book, Final Judgment, that some Israelis were the masterminds of the President Kennedy assassination.
You didn't used to kill women and children in war when the British Army, when they were pure kind of, you didn't go out and kill. I think Dresden, they did do some of that, but that was Walt Whitman Rostow and his crowd. And he's a very dangerous man, because Walt Whitman Rostow is a communist.
Okay, and in what capacity is he?
Oh, he was one of the wise men in Kennedy's administration. I think he was probably responsible for the movement that got Kennedy murdered. I believe it was an Israeli group which did it with some of these rogues. Walt Whitman Rostow was the one who got us into the Vietnam War because he wanted to sell the weapons and stuff. He and Victor Krulak, who is the present commandant's father, Krulak was his lackey. Walt Whitman Rostow's lackey. Walt Whitman Rostow went with Taylor, General Taylor, and wrote the report that got us into the Vietnam War. And all the time that the Pentagon was saying no, 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 he was a cheerleader for the weapons sales. He and Henry Kissinger, Heinz. He and Henry. Walt Whitman Rostow, Eugene Debs Rostow, these were communists, named for communists. Eugene Debs Rostow and it's either his son or his other brother, runs the big Boston mob, the port there. His name is Nicholas Rostow.
She claims that the war in Bosnia was also manipulated by these people, and that the CIA is not as important as we assume it is. She believes that most of the secret operations are coming from a group of criminals working within our military and NATO. Sometimes she refers to them as the Joint.
The war in Bosnia is simply a stage to train assassins, to be a market for brand new weapons, to be a marketplace so that the drug money can be used. And the Army runs the whole show. It's totally run by the Army. The CIA is a bogus thing. You know, it's Training and Doctrine Command. It's NATO. It's SHAPE. Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, started by Eisenhower. It's a totally independent corporation. Its main function is to sell weapons and launder money.
You're talking about CIA?
No,
No,
I'm talking
no.
about SHAPE.
SHAPE. Okay.
CIA is kind of bogus. I mean,
That's just
there.
a trade name for the media
Oh, it's to
to
confuse
use.
us. It's just to get us off the track. It's all being done by Army people who are now joint.
She describes the Joint as being in New York and that it acts as a funding organization for their criminal activities.
The funding organization, one of the funding organizations was out of New York, and it was called the Joint. And Meyer Lansky, see, our mob, the organized crime, the Jewish Kabbalist group.
Unlike the gangsters of Al Capone's era, Meyer Lansky and his friends can manipulate entire nations rather than just a few cities. In this next segment, she mentions that one of the operations that the Joint was funding was the illegal immigration of Nazis into America. Since she describes the Joint as being Jewish, your first thought might be to assume that they were helping Jews escape Nazi Germany. However, what she describes may be what other people refer to as Operation Paperclip, although she does not use that expression. She is going to mention that many of these Nazis had the German disease, and she refers to them as the Pink Triangle Boys. She is referring to homosexuality and sex with children. The Nazi Party had the same problem that the Republican Party suffers from. Specifically, there are a lot of accusations that many top Nazi and Republican leaders are homosexual, that some are raping children on a regular basis, and that some are covering up the slave trade. In Nazi Germany, some of the rapists and homosexuals were arrested and put into prison camps, and pink triangles were put on their uniforms to identify them from the other prisoners. She believes that thousands of these pink triangle boys were brought to America at the end of World War II. She also claims that the Nazi government was brought down by the German people when reports about the raping of children started spreading through the population. This seems to be happening right now with the Bush administration. The Jeff Gannon incident seems to be forcing a lot of people to face the possibility that many top government officials are not what they claim to be.
This funding group in New York, they would pay for passports which were illegal, and in fact, my grandfather was involved with that. That's how I know so much about it, because my grandfather was told to keep silent and not to tell anybody, but of course he told my grandmother, and my grandmother told me, and I've told my children. Everybody knows they brought in probably more than 200,000 Nazi soldiers and SS and, you know, wacko scientists and psychologists, and all of them, most of them, had the German disease, you know, because it was their culture.
The German disease?
Yeah, the German disease is what the Pink Triangle boys were. Colonel Ron Ray writes about this. He's a Marine colonel who's a Christian who's writing about the Cherry Marines, the homosexuality in the group sex orgies and so forth, which brought down the German government, because Naples, which is where all of the Navy is doing their playing. I mean, today in Naples, these orgies are going on. It was where Krupp, the weapons manufacturer, used to take the German high command, and they would go into the Isle of Capri, into the Blue Grotto. And they would have big orchestras. And they'd bring in little boys, little Italian boys, who would be raped. They'd give them trinkets. And, of course, the mothers gradually found out, and just like me, it was one thing when there was just one of me. Now there are a lot more of us wives who are talking and telling truth. And it took those Italian women went to newspapers in Italy. They wouldn't listen. But when they went to the wives of these guys in Germany, it brought it all out. It brought the German government down because they were duplicitous in it, you know. But what they were doing was pedophilia. They were raping, bringing in little boys. They involved the Catholic priests, you know, who were bringing in all. Anyway, so, but what happened was this whole group came over to the United States. And they, it's an old culture, but it is the reason there are a lot of things going on with children these days.
Mm-hmm.
And it explains why it's all being covered up, because if you've got police officers who are playing these games and they're going in the woods like to, what is this place where, I mean, even Eisenhower played these games. Even Mike Kemp out in, it's called the Hermitage.
The Hermitage.
In California, where they all run, they get drunk and they run around nude in the woods and stuff.
Bohemian Grove kind of
That's
thing.
it, Bohemian Grove.
Okay, and rather than Hermitage, it's the Bohemian
Grove.
Grove.
That's the name of it.
Uh-huh.
My brain's tired.
That's okay.
And the one in, there was a big one in Washington called Rush River Lodge, where they used to all go, and there are lots of places now. But the problem, as I see it, is that I think they're trying to destroy America.
She also accuses Caspar Weinberger of being part of this group of criminals.
They're selling weapons. I mean, that's what the military is doing. It's totally controlled by the mob. Look at this. Weinberger was General Douglas MacArthur's. He spied on MacArthur in Korea. Who was MacArthur's nemesis? Albatross. It was none other than little old intelligence. I'm going to tell every move you make. Weinberger. Young, but he did it. He brought down MacArthur. Every move MacArthur was going to make, he broadcast it through the chaplain, his little intelligence network. And he got brownie points with the group because he brought down the big lion. When you get rid of a big lion like that, you get a big job. You've done good work. And they needed to get rid of MacArthur because he didn't want to keep the wars going. He wanted it over, and you know, it's like General Trefay, who took over after the Vietnam War was over, and he was on C-SPAN in August of '96 with former Ambassador Whitehead and a few of the other the State Department Vietnam people. And General Trefay, he had been holding this in for years. He was on C-SPAN. This man let it all out. He said, I took over at the end of the Vietnam War. I was in control, right? Big general charge. So I say, cut off the shipment of weapons. So I tell the Pentagon, cut off the shipment of weapons. He said, I got a phone call from Henry Kissinger saying the weapons are going to continue at the wartime rate.
Just when you think you've heard the strangest accusation possible, she comes up with another one that's even more difficult to believe. For example, she claims that some communist dictators were also put through the homosexual mind control procedure by these criminals.
Because already the communist agents, the New York, Brooklyn, New Jersey mob, were already training Mao. Mao was trained in Paris. So was, the one in Cambodia. What's his name? I can't think of his name. The one who was Pol Pot.
Yeah.
They were homosexually, bless their little hearts, by priests. They were wonderful little boys sent there, turned, which is the word, when they believe their mothers, and then all of a sudden the world's horrible, and then they have these wonderful friends who are going to make them leaders.
Yeah.
They're turned psychologically, and it's a pattern. And so this is why it's so important to know what they are doing to innocent little boys in the Army and the Marine Corps today.
In her 8 hours of interview, she lets out a lot of accusations, and she accuses a lot of high-ranking government officials of a lot of serious crimes. She does not show any signs of hesitation or fear, except when asked one particular question. In this next segment, she is explaining that both her uncle and her husband were involved in secret weapon sales to a certain country for the joint. Which country? And who is the joint? This is the only issue that she hesitates to talk about. However, after saying the Z word, she returns to normal and resumes her accusations of murder, corruption, and sexual perversion.
Selling weapons to whatever country. I know the country, but in other words, they were doing work for the joint under the table all these years.
Okay, and directly under whose instructions to sell these weapons? Do you know that?
Yeah.
Okay, and who would that be?
Well, it's the Israeli Zionist group in New York.
Mossad? No.
Well,
what would they
yeah,
call
but
themselves?
everybody thinks Mossad, like they think CIA is just a bogus sort of thing. It's really Army intelligence that does just about everything. They run a lot of the psychological profiling, which is done at Quantico with the FBI. It's all a very small group. Harvard professors connected with, the Tavistock and Dar es Salaam, and there's a sexual perversion group in Vienna and one in Colorado. I think that little girl was part of that experiment, who was
John
murdered.
Benet Ramsey?
Yeah, because I had some...
Well, that raises an interesting point, because here's a high-profile murder that goes nowhere. No investigation, nobody's pinned. It just goes on and on and on.
The parents are involved in that program.
But somebody higher
High
up
level.
is protecting them.
Absolutely.
And the same thing that you're describing about the military.
Sure.
If you're in the clique, you can get away with murder.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Murder, literally murder.
As many women do, she would introduce people to one another to help them find friends. She helped both her husband and one of her friends from school meet a man named T. Parker Host. She later decided that Parker Host was connected with organized crime. However, her friend from school married him anyway.
This is his wife, Anne, and I introduced him to her.
Good work.
She's my school friend,
Is she still married to him?
Yeah, I mean, he's loaded. She wants a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Her uncle is one of the guys who went to the moon, Collins.
She mentions that her friend is related to Michael Collins, who went to the moon on Apollo 11. If you believe NASA sent people to the moon, take a look at my science challenge at my website. 6 groups of astronauts were sent to the moon, but not one of them saw stars. NASA claims that stars cannot be seen on the moon because the sun is too bright. A video called "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon" shows the portion of the press conference where the astronauts were asked about the stars. Neil Armstrong answers, and afterwards Michael Collins makes a remark that he does not remember seeing any stars. Michael Collins was in the command module that was circling the moon, while the other 2 astronauts were on the surface of the moon.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Collins wants us to believe that during his entire trip to and from the moon, he never bothered to look out the window. These three astronauts just accomplished the most incredible achievement the human race has ever made. But notice how sad, nervous, and worried they look. Why would NASA fake a moon landing? Perhaps, as Kay Griggs says,
I think they're trying to destroy America.
A fake moon landing can destroy morale among scientists and make America look like a nation of idiots. The news reporters also seem to be controlled by these criminals and their pink triangle boyfriends. News reports about child sex and homosexuality among government officials are quickly suppressed. For example, do you remember when Colin Powell discussed the issue of sex slaves?
We're talking about women and girls as young as 6 years old trafficked into commercial sexual exploitation.
Not many people know about this issue because the television news reporters prefer to talk about Michael Jackson and Terry Schiavo. 100 years ago, Al Capone and other gangsters were manipulating city governments. Today, the criminals are manipulating entire nations. Most people's reaction is to complain about the criminals. However, the criminals are not the problem. As I wrote on page 150 of my book, a nation that has an incompetent government is vulnerable to abuse from both its own citizens and from foreign nations. Complaining about corruption will not make the world better. Instead, we should be discussing the issue of how to provide ourselves with better governments.